it's 8 o'clock here in Helsinki at the moment, seminar on Europe, the GDR, and the Cold War, from the Euromissiles crisis to reunification. And this event is part of a series of ongoing discussions organized by a project and network called Nowall, from Helsinki to Berlin, Europe, and the end of the Cold War, which focuses on precisely this period at the end of the Cold War in the 1970s and 80s, but also specifically on the agency of Europe and European actors between the superpowers in this history. And the project is coordinated at the Lisbon University Institute. So I wish to thank, first of all, its main coordinator, Luis Rodriguez. I don't know if you're here. And also very much thanks to Silvia Berendt and Felix Suarez for organizing tonight's event. They are from Young Educators Europe in Lisbon. And my name is Stefan Nygård. I'm an intellectual historian based at the University of Helsinki. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. There are three speakers. The first one is Kirill Kunahovich from the University of Virginia. And the second talk will be by Paul Rubinson from Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. And then the final presentation by Dr. Angela Romano from the University of Glasgow. And I will introduce them separately before their presentations, but just say to start off that all of these discussions will focus on the experiences of ordinary citizens, activists, and also on the role of economic and social relations across the Iron Curtain at the end of the Cold War. And before diving into this period, let me start by sharing a small anecdote with you. So very recently, or before the pandemic anyway, I was having lunch here at a restaurant in Helsinki and witnessed an interesting discussion on the topic of Cold War nostalgia. Namely, at the table behind me, there was a group of gray-haired gentlemen with equally gray suits, and they were fondly remembering the good old days when their businesses across the Iron Curtain were flourishing. So Finland in this period had privileged economic relations with the Soviet Union and a clearing, trade, and payment system that lasted from the early 1950s to 1990. And what struck me in particular about these discussions was how they talked about this period as a time when commercial life was well structured, organized according to long-term plans, and without any hint of the kind of stress that comes with quarterly capitalism. So I don't know quite what to make of this, but it seems that Cold War nostalgia sometimes revolves around a longing for an imagined past when the world somehow made sense, and what some historians have labeled antagonistic cooperation, which provided a peculiar form of structure and also perhaps some excitement. But as our discussions today will show, these structures were not at all as fixed as we tend to think. Lines were blurred by cultural and economic exchanges, and increasingly so in the 1970s and 80s, which we will focus on today in looking at some of the citizen social movements and the economic actors that contributed to relaxing the Cold War partition already before the end of the Berlin Wall. So as I mentioned, we have three presentations, and then we'll take them all one after the other, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. And the first presentation is by, as I mentioned, by Kirill Kunahovich, who is assistant professor of history at the University of Virginia. He is a historian of modern Europe with a particular focus on Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. He is the co-editor of the 2018 volume, The Long 1989 Decades of Global Revolution, which came out at Central European University Press. And he's currently working on a book on communism's public sphere, culture as politics in Cold War Poland and East Germany, where he will be focusing on two cities, Krakow in Poland and Leipzig in the GDR, and on cross-fertilizing entanglements between communist politics and the arts. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kirill Kunahovich, who will talk about the view from below, how ordinary East Germans shaped the Cold War. And I will now share the screen with you, Kirill.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stefan, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Sylvia and the other organizers for putting this together. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Now, would it be possible to share my screen? I don't think I can do that quite yet. Wonderful, thank you. So I would like to start today with the following image by the Polish graphic artist Roman Cieślewicz. And I think it encapsulates how we tend to think of the Cold War, right? As a battle between two competing superpowers, supermen, both invincible, fighting and racing to the finish line. And this is, of course, a very partial image because, as Stefan has already hinted, this omits a whole lot of actors, including smaller states like the GDR, but also lots of non-state actors. And that's really what I'm interested in today, is what's behind the image of Superman here? Who are the ordinary Clark Kents that are hidden in the cape of these two superpowers? And when it comes to the GDR, there's also an image that comes to mind when we think of popular pressure. And it's likely to be this. It is a crowd gathered in the city of Leipzig in October 1989. In fact, on October 9th, there was a crowd of some 70,000 people that spontaneously assembled, that chanted, "We are the people," called for reform, criticized the regime. And even though the regime had about 8,000 policemen and military units in the area, even though it could easily have dispersed the crowd, it did not. It allowed it to proceed all the way around the city. And the conductor, Kurt Masur, who was present on the scene, called it the miracle of Leipzig. And that image, I think, is still how we tend to think about this moment, as this spontaneous, unexpected, sudden revolution, when people power overwhelmed the power of the state, effectively like David against Goliath. And I'd like to argue today that that image is only half true. I do think that it shows the power of people power, but this was no sudden moment. This was not something that happened on the night of October 9th. In fact, I'd like to argue that this people power was a much longer and more gradual process that had been brewing for decades and that paved the way for this moment we see here, not as a sudden overthrow in which the people overwhelmed the state, but rather as the end goal and the end product of a process in which the people transformed the state, asserted themselves as actors, not just within the GDR, but on the world stage. With the result that an East German stamp like this one could actually still commemorate the moment. And so I'd like to kind of trace this process of popular influence and popular pressure on the state by looking at three domains of East German society: culture, economics, and even politics, to kind of sketch out very briefly some of the contours of this gradual people power. So let me start in the economic realm. The GDR was, of course, a planned economy, and that meant that it planned both production and consumption. And in the early stages of the GDR, consumption was very much given second shrift. It was far overshadowed by the imperatives of production, and it was understood in a very mechanistic way, as demonstrated in this image. Consumption was something one did because one had to. And so the state-run supermarkets chain, Consum, could advertise that children could help out their mothers. by going shopping there. This was a fulfillment of needs. In fact, that was something that the GDR touted as the socialist mode of consumption, precisely in opposition to the West. They said the task of the planned socialist economy is first to satisfy not the individual need, but rather the social need. It's only the capitalist mentality that assumes that the most important task is the satisfaction of individual needs. So there was an ideological vision of consumption as both something that was purely mechanistic and also as something that had been trumpeted to excesses in the West. This was caught up in Cold War discourses. And very quickly, Fred Elsner said this in 1947, but already within a handful of years, by 1953, when protesters take to the streets of the GDR on June 17th, consumption and consumer needs take center stage. They chant in Leipzig on the same path that protesters later would take in 1989. We want butter instead of cannons. We want to live better. These are consumer demands being expressed in the public, in the open. And the regime gave way, so to speak. The regime took that to heart. And the symbol of it, created, opened in 1968, is a major department store in Leipzig. 4 floors of shopping, an arcade, a childcare facility, this temple to consumerism. And the name of it really said it all. It was called Konsument, the consumer. And unlike these earlier visions that I mentioned a minute ago, it understood consumption not just as something that had to be done and that had to be planned, but rather as a process of self-discovery, of satisfying individualized personal needs, something that could be shown in window displays and something that could be touted by government officials. So the GDR's chief economic planner, Günther Mittag, said the following year, consumption as socialism is not simply a matter of needing something and getting it, but rather a process by which the socialist personality was created, effectively reframing consumption as something integral to the formation of the self, and here even the individual self. That already, I would argue, represents a real shift in government thinking. But what's even more interesting to me is how foundational that becomes for government policy. That later in the following decade, by the 1970s, we know the GDR starts to borrow heavily from the West in order to finance department stores like Konsument. And by the mid-70s, it lands in a balance of payments crisis that prevents how much it's able to import. It leads to shortages of imported goods like coffee and ersatz solutions like this. And by 1979, the Politburo is meeting to discuss this crisis and to consider steps forward. There are members who suggest that this unbridled consumerism is something the GDR simply cannot afford, that it must raise prices, as other Soviet bloc states did, in order to rein in this unbridled spending. And Erich Honecker's reply, the head of the Politburo, is very telling. He says prices are more dangerous than ideas. Anybody who runs down our consumer goods industry, this great development of the past few years, will get his face pushed in. And that's that. There's no more discussion in the GDR of raising prices. Instead, the government continues to borrow, and in fact borrows more and more heavily. So this shift towards accepting a popular demand for consumer goods not only becomes accepted as part of the socialist vision, but also brings the GDR deeper and deeper into debt, especially debt vis-a-vis the Federal Republic of Germany across the Iron Curtain. Let me trace a kind of similar pattern in the cultural sphere. The GDR understood itself as a state of culture, specifically high culture. It portrayed itself as a bastion of culturedness against a Western non-culture, Unkultur. And that rhetoric really came to the fore in the 1950s and then 1960s in talking about rock and roll. East German newspapers covered every major concert in West Germany. They viewed it as an orgy of American unculture. As the headline says here, they portrayed Elvis Presley and other rock musicians as completely, civilization degenerated, run amok. And yet, within a few years, they felt the pressure to keep up, pressure from ordinary citizens who demanded to have that very same thing that the regime had been trying to put down. Elvis Presley, the idol, this is one of many such signs that circulated in the GDR. And when faced with the possibility of losing popular attention, especially youth attention, the regime changed course, ended up promoting rock and roll, forming youth groups like Leipzig's Butlers, putting them on television, putting them on state-owned labels. Now, in these cases, the state could at least claim that they were doing something slightly different than the West, that this was rock music, but socialist style. They couldn't really claim that in the case of Western media. Western media was easily accessible in the GDR. Western television was widespread across the country from 1957 on. And initially, the state's response was to discourage people from viewing it, right? To clamp down. If they couldn't prevent it from reaching screens, they at least hoped to stop people from watching. But that campaign proved quite unsuccessful, unsurprisingly, but thanks to attitudes like this. A Leipzig worker, in response to this push in 1961, said, "I will take my TV set down, all right, but you cannot expect me to watch their programs. I will just get rid of the set." And that argument that people refused to engage with socialist television if they did not have this carrot of Western media proved effective. By 1973, Honecker explicitly spoke of Western television as something that each citizen in the GDR could watch. But there were some exceptions. There were some areas of the country, mostly on the Polish and Czechoslovak border, that could not receive West German signals and were therefore known as the Valley of the Clueless. And officials, in fact, noted that they had higher rates of emigration applications than other parts of the country. And in a really remarkable move by the late 70s and accelerating in the 1980s, officials actually laid cables to rebroadcast Western television in the Valley of the Clueless, which is a pretty incredible thing to do, right? For any state, never mind one locked in a Cold War competition, to take foreign programming and rebroadcast it to your own citizens as a carrot to prevent them from leaving. So we've got here consumption and consumer goods becoming integrated into the GDR economy, even at the cost of Western loans. We have Western television being rebroadcast to East German citizens. And perhaps most surprisingly, we have a growing political pluralism by the 1980s. That was anathema, not just to the GDR regime, but to communist parties as a whole. I could go back to Lenin and even further in the view of bourgeois democracy as fundamentally illegitimate, but also as an illusion. The idea of interest groups, of pluralist parties, well, for Lenin, they're always bound to remain truncated, false, and hypocritical. The only way forward is down with the system, and instead to create a monopoly party as the vanguard of the working class, which will then have a number of kind of social subsidiaries that were meant to function as transmission belts. And that's how Ulbricht put it in the 1950s. Mass organizations such as the trade union, the youth league, are transmission belts that connect the vanguard of the working class with the broad masses. So it's a very unified, centralized, top-down vision. But we see by the 1980s that officials are starting to legalize a great deal of local groups, not just tolerate them, but giving them official sanction. Even private galleries, such as Eigen Art in Leipzig, a working group for human rights that is given space under the umbrella of the Protestant churches in the city, youth groups, both from the culture society and also in the church umbrella. So there's a lot of new political actors, new interest groups, many of them explicitly basing themselves on Western models and parallel institutions. And why are they being legalized and brought about? Well, there's a telling conversation between two officials that takes place around planning for a Leipzig folk music workshop in 1984. And one official, a certain Relpach from the Central Committee, makes his position clear. He says, are these really folk musicians or mountebanks? We won't let ourselves be pissed on. But his colleague and comrade, a certain Foreman, replies, well, it's just the other way around. Because of their oppositional attitudes, we must prevent them from sliding into the ground, signal our willingness to reach an understanding, legalize them, and give them space. And there are about 300 to 400 independent groups operating in East Germany by the 1980s, able to put on marches and public demonstrations carrying signs like this for an open country and free people. And officials are not concerned by this. Günter Schabowski, a spokesman for the regime, says these groups bothered us, but we did not perceive them as a threat to our existence. And I think he's right. They weren't a threat. I don't want to argue that these groups undermine socialism any more than did Western television or consumerism. But I do think they changed the playing field because they changed the state. They changed the nature of the regime. And so the regime that confronted this crowd of protesters on October 9th was not so sure how to respond. It had, after all, accepted similar marches in the past. And more broadly, it had accepted the principle of self-interest and self-representation. It had allowed groups and individuals to press their claims in the public sphere. How different was what took place on October 9th? Consumption was visible as well. And it's no accident, perhaps, that this crowd weaved right past the Konsument department store. The claim to fulfilling one's needs through consumer goods not only became something the regime accepted, but something that constrained its freedom of action. It knew that it could crack down on this particular crowd, but it would lose the Western credits that kept it in business. And it knew as well that everything it did would be broadcast almost live on Western television. And indeed, this demonstration was shown the same night on Western TV, not just in the West, but also in East Germany, precisely because the state had made those signals so accessible. And that had the effect of amplifying the message of the uprising, of encouraging similar tactics. And within just 1 month, by November 9th, the Berlin Wall had fallen and the dynamic of the Cold War had changed. And so what I take away from this is the idea that not only is there pressure behind these superheroes and these actors, but that this pressure had in fact transformed what the GDR was. And it had transformed the way that the GDR engaged with the West. And so by 1989, if not before, these two Supermen were indeed not so different from each other, perhaps, as they might first seem. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirill, for this truly exciting talk that raises a lot of questions that have to do with the relationship between economic, political, and cultural change. I mean, of course, we can only artificially separate them from each other, but you point out very nicely things that one doesn't immediately come to think about. and we will have the occasion to return to them in the question and answers session later. I suspect there will also be some overlap with, for instance, Angela's talk with respect to the price of importing culture and the dangers of having to borrow in order to afford it. So we can have an interesting discussion. I forgot to mention at the start that everyone, please, I encourage you to keep in mind your questions for later, but you can also write them whenever you feel in the chat section, and I will take notes and try to mediate at the end. But we now move on to the second presentation, which is by Paul Rubinson, who is Associate Professor of History at Bridgewater State University. He currently works on the long-term relationship between scientists and the development of human rights in a long period from the 1790s to the 1970s. He has previously authored Redefining Science, Scientists, the National Security State, and Nuclear Weapons in Cold War America, which was published in 2016, and Rethinking the Anti-Nuclear Movement from 2017. And moreover, he has edited and written numerous articles and books on the Cold War science and human rights. So it's a great pleasure to have Paul Rubinson with us tonight, and he will speak on the topic of a Europe free of nuclear weapons, transnational anti-nuclear activism, and the end of the Cold War.
All right, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being here. As Kirill gave us the view from below, I'm going to give, I guess, a view kind of from above. This is going to be a broad view, painting with a pretty broad brush here. So there will be, you know, I might have to oversimplify at times, but be sure to just call me out in the Q&A, and we can talk with this with more nuance. But I want to talk about nuclear weapons and the transformation of anti-nuclear protest in the 1980s. Now, the picture I've just put up is from the United States, and my slides don't always, they're not always, they're kind of random. But at any rate, I want to talk about Europe because anti-nuclear protest, I think, really transforms in the 1980s, and it does so in Europe, in a Europe that is increasingly seeing itself as a kind of actor, you know, as Kira pointed out, in the shadow of these two superpowers, which no longer have quite as much authority as they had for Europe. So I will talk about how the anti-nuclear movement changed in the 1980s. But first, I want to say that before that, anti-nuclear protests before the 1980s, as a contrast, some of its characteristics, and again, I'm speaking somewhat generally, was the anti-nuclear movement tended to be national in nature, right? Countries had their own anti-nuclear movements, but without much interaction or coordination with other countries. Now, there were exceptions, of course, but for the most part, you know, US activists opposed US nuclear weapons, British activists opposed British nuclear weapons, and so on. There were certainly organizations in European countries, in Japan, Australia. It was global in that sense, but the activism tended to be restricted to single countries, mainly, certainly in the United States case, because international or transnational activism made authorities think you were a communist, right? So they had to kind of avoid working across borders in the 1950s and 60s. These groups, in addition to being moderate, in addition to being national movements, were moderate in their tactics and in their goals. One of the best examples was the achievement in 1963 of a nuclear test ban treaty. And this was seen as a goal of many anti-nuclear movements because it would end fallout. It was this kind of almost a public health measure. And it was something that, you know, politicians weren't totally afraid of. You know, it wasn't super radical, right? But when they achieved it in 1963, right, it's well known that after the test ban, nuclear testing actually increased, right? And that's not a very good test ban. And so the moderate nature of it before the 1980s is very much kind of blown out of the water by the time of this new decade. And I think it very much is because of what happens in Europe and across Europe. The initial, I'll get to my slides in a bit. I'm just a little bit behind, but in the 1980s, one of the sparks of the anti-nuclear movement is the Euromissiles, right? And it is European activism that erupts on a large scale to protest the deployment of nuclear cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, NATO countries, and Soviet SS-20s to Eastern Europe. And so that's the proximate cause. But I think that underneath that were bigger factors. And I think, Kirill talked about some of them, but the revolutions of 1968, I think, also kind of sparked a new form of protest, new identities, new ways of seeing, and people came to see themselves in a kind of global context, more so than other movements, particularly the anti-nuclear movement of before the late 60s or early 70s. So you have that kind of undergirding it. You have also a world that is more connected, of course, through technology, satellite television, long distance phone calls, airplane travel, fax machines, all these things. And so it's easier to communicate around the world. But you also have a world that is kind of, for all this connectivity, it's also collectively more endangered, or at least they're realizing it. One of the famous examples is the nuclear winter hypothesis of the 1980s. It argued that a nuclear war would cause so much burning and so much smoke and particulate matter that it would block sunlight around the world, causing temperatures on land to plummet maybe to -15 degrees centigrade. And this cold and darkness would threaten human survivors with starvation. It would halt photosynthesis and maybe break down food networks, and leaving more people to starve than were actually killed in a nuclear war, right? So you have this shared global danger along with global relationships that are growing. And then, yes, in Europe, you have Ostpolitik and the notion that many in Europe are disaffected with the bipolar Cold War, the superpowers, and détente. The Nobel Prize winning Swedish activist Alva Myrdal described the newly rekindled fire of resistance to nuclear weapons. She said that Europe would not be snared by the allurements of either the one or the other of the superpowers, not by the one in the East, nor by the one in the West. And so in the fall of 1983, you have about 5 million Western Europeans participating in anti-nuclear demonstrations against the Euromissiles. And obviously in Eastern Europe, it was a different situation where protesting wasn't quite as easy. But there was activism there as well, which we'll talk about. So some of the transformations of the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s, and I think, again, driven by European ideologies, is you have a transnational response to this transnational threat of nuclear weapons. And you have new ideologies from the late 1960s that are embracing anti-nuclear ethos as part of their way of, seeing the world. So, for example, you have feminists, a movement that soars in the 1970s, who come to see nuclear weapons as just another form of patriarchy. I have some slides. Well, here are just some slides of the Euromissile protest. I think a lot of these are from Britain. But in terms of feminism, let's see. You have again, this is an American movement, but you can see the logo of the sort of maternal-looking woman kicking a nuclear missile, right? Here's some more. In an anti-nuclear newsletter, you have an article about overcoming masculine oppression in mixed groups, right? So feminists seeing nuclear weapons as just another type of patriarchy. The West German activist Eva Kistrup wrote that in the mid-1970s, she began to see connections between the nuclear complex and the patriarchal society around her. While not aggressive in the male sense, she wrote, we declare war not on another nation or race or sex, but against this destructive technology. This is the form patriarchy takes today, and it is a destructive form of power that affects everything. Kistrup saw nuclear protest as one aspect of what she called feminist issues, ecological issues, third world issues, and the issue of freedom. In particular, we had to focus on nuclear technology because it is simply not compatible with a female future. And this one activist started a group called German Women for Peace. And so you have, again, people coming to oppose nuclear weapons from different movements, right? They didn't start out as anti-nuclear activists. And I think this is one reason why anti-nuclear opposition is so widespread in this decade. You also, now this may be a more obvious parallel, but the a constituency, I guess, the environmental movement, which also rises in the 1970s, becoming quite large. They also come to see nuclear power in particular as a threat to what they value. Again, that's a pretty direct connection, but the near meltdown at 3 Mile Island at the beginning of the decade and Chernobyl near the end of the decade, of course, bring environmentalists to oppose nuclear energy and weapons as well. Another group that becomes involved in the 1980s to a great extent, a much bigger extent, was religious groups, a pretty decent array of them. In 1980, Pope John Paul II convened what he called the Pontifical Academy, science advisors basically for the Pope, and declared that nuclear war is the greatest moral issue that humanity has ever faced, and there is no time to be lost. Elsewhere, Pope John Paul II urged scientists to resist the subjugation of scientific development to military purposes. And so you have the Catholic Church, agreeing about at least nuclear weapons with feminists, with environmentalists, right? Not always the same people that the Catholic Church gets along with necessarily. The Church of England endorsed nuclear disarmament in 1983. East German churches actively participated in the peace movement. I found one petition distributed by the pastor Rainer Eppelmann declaring that nuclear weapons won't save us, but will destroy us. And people who signed his petition included craftsmen, white and blue collar workers, deacons, writers, scientists, nurses, mechanics, right? A wide array of people. In Britain, the campaign for nuclear disarmament had a Christian subgroup, the Christian CND. And in the 1980s, this became a more vocal and more active part of CND. And they declared that the possession of nuclear weapons is totally incompatible with being a follower of Jesus Christ. Another group that comes to embrace anti-nuclear activism, the human rights movement, which is growing tremendously, starting, could go back to the late 60s, but it's kind of soars in the 1970s and then in the 1980s. In 1975, Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident, wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's recognized largely for his human rights activism. But when he wins the prize, he announces that the elimination of the threat of nuclear weapons takes unquestionable priority over all other problems in international relations. So this guy, known for his human rights work, is arguing that, well, actually nuclear weapons are a bigger threat, right? You can see nuclear weapons as a violation of human rights in some ways. And Sakharov, not all human rights activists agree necessarily, but Sakharov is saying that this is the case. So you have this wide coalition of people sort of ending up at an anti-nuclear point of view, even if it wasn't the original motivation for their movement. You also have a change in tactics, and this is again in the United States, but it is typical. Well, not typical. This is the largest protest in U.S. history in June of 1982 at the United Nations session for the nuclear freeze. And I just bring this up because in earlier decades, the anti-nuclear movement was very respectable. It was very kind of, again, moderate, didn't want to look radical, wanted to look very mainstream, and you would not have seen this kind of widespread direct action kind of protest. But of course, maybe the most famous were the women of Greenham Common at the Greenham Common Air Base in Great Britain, who engaged in civil disobedience, blockading the base, breaking into the base, right, disrupting the base, a lot of arrests, and of course they had a feminist ideology as well, right? Men not allowed at the camps. And this pattern was repeated in the United States. There was a famous blockading of the Seneca Falls, New York base, where they thought cruise missiles were being held. And the women there tied their activism to their suffragist foremothers, as they called it, who had worked for women's rights and the abolition of slavery. So taking this to making nuclear weapons a women's cause, rather than just trying to get people to oppose nuclear weapons, it's more, oh, you're a feminist, well, you're against nuclear weapons, right? Is one of the hallmarks of this movement. Now, another hallmark of this movement and the new tactics is a pretty blatant disregard for national borders, right? The idea that the Iron Curtain and everything is almost obsolete. European nuclear disarmament, one of the larger groups of the era, one of their leaders, Mary Kaldor, asserted that END is not an arms control proposal, but a political objective, envisioned as a Europe free of nuclear weapons from Poland to Portugal. And the first issue of their journal declared that the peace movement is here to stay. The strength of the movement grows through the spread of ideas. The very diversity of the movement is the source of inspiration and creativity. You also had physicians crossing borders, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. They had a Soviet leader and a US leader. Now that group was controversial for some reasons, and we can get into that. But you had Physicians for Social Responsibility, largely a US group, but led by an Australian who had moved to Boston. So again, people from all over taking part. It's no longer, the Red Scare. You're not automatically seen as a communist if you have connections in other countries. And one great piece of evidence of the international reach and the transnational reach of this anti-nuclear movement and how it coincides with all these other movements, April 12th, 1985, there was a rally in Moscow at Gagarin Square, that was Cosmonauts Day, where protesters there shouted, "Tell the truth about the nuclear winter phenomenon to our people." Remember the nuclear winter phenomenon, the theory that all life on Earth would be, killed, starved in the aftermath of a nuclear war. This was a demonstration. It came on the heels of one where protesters chanted, "No more prisoners of peace." After that, at a different protest, they chanted solidarity of grassroots peace activists, East and West, right? So you see these transnational connections and how nuclear weapons are just one of these many violations of human rights or what have you. And it was END, European Nuclear Disarmament, whose contacts reported on this protest, and that one of the participants, a physician named Vladimir Brodsky, was arrested in July of 1985 for what the Soviets called hooliganism, which was transmitting a letter to the Soviet Academy of Sciences requesting greater publicity about the nuclear winter. Now, it turns out Brodsky was a member of the Moscow Trust Group, which was a human rights group in the Soviet Union, well, in Moscow, obviously, and they aimed to facilitate an increase in the amount and extent of direct contacts and free exchange of information between the peoples of East and West. So I just wanted to highlight how the anti-nuclear movement is not isolated from these other movements and fits right in and enables the spread of a lot of these ideas. And to get to the end of the Cold War, just very quickly, scholars have been studying how the creation of human rights networks enabled transnational communication. It undermined authorities in Eastern European and Soviet Eastern European countries in the Soviet Union, right? And the anti-nuclear movement is part of it, right? It also has these networks. It also has an emphasis on bringing all of Europe together, tearing down the Iron Curtain, and so I think this is how this movement that starts in Europe ends with, in many ways, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and gets all these other groups involved that take on the Cold War and bring it to an end. All right, I'll stop there. But thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Thank you very much, Paul, for pointing us towards the blurring of lines, not only across the Cold War border, but also the formation of surprising alliances in many cases, which we will have the chance to discuss after the next and final presentation by Dr. Angela Romano, who is from the University of Glasgow. She is an international historian of the 20th century, and she has written extensively on the Cold War, regional integration and cooperation processes, and on international and transnational political and economic relations. She has published on these subjects, and before joining the University of Glasgow, she has presented her work at various universities in Europe, the US, and Japan, and carried out research projects, notably at the European University Institute in Florence, such as a project on entitled, I don't know how you pronounce this, Angela, Pan 1870. You can correct me. Please, Angela, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this kind introduction. So I'll come to the project in the end. Pan-Euro 1970s, Pan-Euro 1970s. I'm happy for anybody to pronounce as they wish. So I'm going to share my screen now to provide some order to my thoughts. So most of what I'm going to share with you comes from the research that we made in this big research project, which was a collective effort, very much. So I'm going to focus on the economic connections between the GDR and Western Europe in order to, let's say, overcome the Iron Curtain as a barrier to at least this kind of relations. And this presentation is going to be a little bit different in the sense that I'll let you see the presence of people, but we will see that it's very centralized in the case of the GDR, and this was not the case in other socialist countries. So the GDR is a very peculiar, indeed, sort of regime when it comes to run the economy in the socialist countries. So I will first deal with the situation in divided Europe to remind us of some things that have been also mentioned by my colleagues in any case, then focus on the GDR in Western Europe, and finally bring to the fore the people who were responsible for running these economic relations. So the two aspects that I would like to highlight about the situation in Europe between the Euromissiles crisis and reunification is that there was this huge Cold War confrontation again, materialized, embedded, really symbolized by missiles literally pointing against one bloc against the other. But there was also, by the time, a great space of European cooperation which embraced all of Europe, which I call pan-European cooperation. So if we have a look at the dreadful picture, this is taken from the CVC website, which has amazing resources for European integration history in general, not just easy. So if we look at where the missiles were placed and the territory they could achieve, so this is basically the range of Soviet missiles, so all of Europe could be hit, and that's pretty intuitive, of course. But thanks to the deployment in the early 80s of US Pershing and above all cruise missiles, the Western alliance, NATO, could strike back, or could strike as the first, on not only on all the European socialist countries' territories, but also the European territory of the Soviet Union, and particularly rich the territory around the capital of the Soviet Union, Moscow. So this is really a dreadful situation, and if we, and this is a reminder of Europe being divided into two military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, facing one another. But at the same time, since the early 70s, because of the Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, we do have the beginning of the creation of this sort of pan-European space for cooperation, dialogue on many different places. And we see here that there are indeed NATO and the Warsaw Pact represented, all their states, but we also have the neutral and non-aligned countries participating in the Helsinki CSE. And within these groups, which are very much the Cold War, differentiation of opposing blocs, we do have within the CSE the formation of ad hoc groups according to their interests. So we do have the European Community member states acting autonomously from NATO within the Helsinki process. We do have a mini group of German-speaking nations. So one is from NATO, the Federal Republic of Germany. The other is the GDR from the Warsaw Pact. And of course, there's Austria, which is neutral. We have the group of the Nordic nations, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. We have a group of the Mediterranean nations. So again, spanning according to interest and geopolitical also considerations that are not necessarily Cold War related. So this is not a bloc-to-bloc negotiation. This is what makes the CSE process very important for providing a good environment. And what I wanted to highlight, because I know you discussed this already in previous conferences, is not very much the human contacts, which becomes, because of the people, human rights, because of the non-NGOs, activists, and so on, and the dissidents, human rights rather than human context. But it's the cooperation in the fields of economics, and the economy, science and technology. And this was very much a goal of the Eastern socialist countries. And it continues to be the case throughout the CSE process, which, as we know, accompanies this Euromissile crisis throughout this revamp of the Cold War in the 80s. It coexists with this, and in the end, it's what will shape the European continent after the end of the Cold War through the Charter of Paris and the institutionalization of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So when we think about the 80s, for a long time, when I was a student, that was the Second Cold War. So my colleagues and I, from a European perspective, are very much trying to bring through research and attention devoted to Europeans and all layers of Europe to what was the reality for Europe, which was likely, significantly different in between the two Supermen, as Kiri was saying. So there is space for context. And if we look at economic relations, we do have two blocs organizing their own economic development, growth, and relations. So the Comecon or CEMEA and the European Economic Community. And the basic here is that there is no recognition of the European Economic Community officially until very late, until 1980 by any of the socialist countries. So keep this in mind. What the socialist countries, all of them, including the GDR, wanted was to get access to Western technology and financial credit in order to modernize their way of production, and so to be able to produce more, export more, and plug into the world economy. But also, they were very much doing so to improve citizens' standards of living. And that was necessary because it's the ideology, as Kirill already mentioned, the consumption, and I'm not going back to that, but also because that was meant to provide continual legitimacy for these regimes. So if you cannot give political freedoms, the very goal of socialism was to provide the best standard of living for all the citizens. So that is the intrinsic promise of a better future and the best system of doing so. But it was also a way for these countries to get some autonomy from the Soviet grip. So opening up to relations with Western Europe was also a way to negotiate national economic policies in a broader sense. So what does this entail is to push for cooperation, economic cooperation in the CSC, to try to establish relations with the European Economic Community, but considering that there is the Comecon, so these two organizations should establish their relations, and then try to figure out the question of direct relations of each single country with the European Economic Community. So this is the bone of contention there, and we see the first peculiarity of the GDR. There were only 3 countries for which, until the very end, and because of them, only one possibility was on the table. So a trade agreement or any form of agreement between the two organizations, the EC and the Comecon. But for other countries which were much more export-oriented and also trying to get a little bit more of autonomy from Moscow, there was the possibility to have both sort of relations. And in addition, for Hungary and Poland, actually the position became let's have individual relations with the EEC, and then the EEC Comecon sort of partnership will develop eventually. And then we have Romania, which was, as usually, much more autonomous, saying exactly the opposite. So they wanted their own relationship with the EEC, and whatever would come out with the Comecon is fine, as long as it does not touch on trade. So what we see for the GDR is the strictest position. So no relations whatsoever with the EEC, only Comecon EEC relations, exactly like Moscow. And this is going to stay. It's really the staunchest country in maintaining this position until the very end, no matter how much it paid consequences for this policy. So what we see in the relations of the GDR is that the Soviet Union remains the first economic partner by far, and it's also the most important politically, of course. But the second one is West Germany, and this is something that has already been mentioned. The problem is that since the two countries have come to recognize one another and established some formal relations, officially speaking, the GDR will always try to get more in terms of economic benefits from the more prosperous Germany, and the Federal Republic of Germany will try to get more in terms of human rights or opening possibilities for the East German citizens from the GDR. So it's a constant bargaining in this sense. But this is the narrative that we usually have. What happens is that in reality, what we found out is that the GDR had a strategy in the 70s and 80s for differentiating its relations, especially to become less dependent from these big two. And this was guided by the most important economic policy paper, which is adopted in 1971, which is basically an expensive welfare policy, including controlling the prices, providing houses to all the citizens, and importing consumer goods. In order to do this, in order to satisfy the people and guarantee the regime stability, the GDR is going to import a lot from Western Europe, and in order to be able to re-export in the future and so compensate. So this is the basic idea. And what we see is that the close dependence on West Germany continues, also because the trade between the two Germanys is considered internal. It's not foreign trade, so it doesn't enter into the barriers of the policies of the European Economic Community. That was established since the beginning, since even before the recognition of the GDR in the Treaty of Rome establishing the European Economic Community. But at the same time, we see some successes in differentiating the economic relations. And we see also this in so many, a program of foreign ministers visits in Western capitals. And then in the 80s also visits by head of state and all government. The problem is that this bilateral trade and economic cooperation never takes up because of the EEC problem. So the German trade is not affected, but the cooperation agreements are not affected, but the trade with the other Western European states is increasingly affected because of the common policies of the European Economic Community. So there is agriculture, there is the common commercial policy, so deciding unilaterally how much can be imported from the socialist countries. So that limits the capacity of the GDR to export towards these other countries. And then on fisheries, on steel. So bit by bit, sectors of the economy are transferred in the competence to the EEC, and that creates, that further reduces the possibility of the GDR to export. So the beautiful plan of the GDR fails. And this necessity to provide welfare to the population is not abandoned by Honecker because, as he said, they cannot do exactly as the capitalists. They cannot cut social policy. This is socialism, cannot do that. So what we have, as Kirill already mentioned, is indebtedness muddling through. There are, what I want to focus on is 90% of imports from the West are financed through debts, through loans given by Western countries. And in the early 80s, there is the risk, actual risk of bankruptcy for the GDR, and this is only avoided because of two major loans from West Germany. So what we have at the end is that the GDR existence basically comes to become dependent only on the West, with a little bit of help from the Soviet Union, but financially speaking is entirely interlinked with Western Europe. So to finish, just to highlight the people involved. So the question of the GDR is that is a very centralized system, which is not really the case for other socialist countries in the 70s and 80s anymore when it comes to economic policy. So we have found out, we have tried to bring to the fore other people, and we found out that there were none. So the decisions are taken not only by the state and the Senate, but by a small circle around Erich Honecker, the Secretary General of the party. And there are some in the state and the party machinery warning against this policy of getting too close to the West, either because of the debt or because of political dependency. And indeed, this circle of other people, it relates with Moscow very much because they see the GDR going towards a very close, suffocating embrace with the West, which is not the intention, but it's the result. Nonetheless, as we can see, the trade negotiations are always conducted by the Minister of Foreign Trade, even by the party economic secretary, Günther Mittag, who is a most important figure in this policy. and by a specific commercial coordination division when it comes to try to stay solvent to avoid bankruptcy. Yet, and this is where we find the people in the lower level. We have some major role of the Chamber of Commerce. That was very prominent before the GDR was recognized by the West. It was basically the people concluding agreements with Western counterparts. After the recognition, it remains part of these economic relations with the West. It's more representative in character, but it's still there, guaranteeing continuity to people-to-people negotiation, businessmen, let's say, negotiations, and in context. We also have an important role in the day-to-day business in trade with the West, played by foreign trade enterprises. So they receive, orders from above, but they are the ones on the ground. And what we found out is that they were the ones immediately feeling and reporting the repercussions of the new EEC policies on import, so alerting the center of what was going on the ground. And indeed, they are the ones who will be allowed to establish technical contacts with the European Community Commission when recognition is still not given, but it's necessary to strike some deals in order to prevent major economic losses. And finally, we have a contribution which is not probably the one intended and positive, but it determines the outcome and the crumbling of the regime. Various industrial sectors, those who were relying on imports of Western technology or even Western equipment, to function, they continue to put pressure to buy from the West. So even when the policy Bionecker would have curbed the imports from the West, these sectors were complicit into deepening the indebtedness and the dependence of the GDR on the West. So in a sense, we have a contribution by the people running these sectors into deepening reliance to the West, into deepening relations with the West, even though that is not necessarily a positive thing for the regime, is accelerating the economic failure of the GDR. So with this, I'm sorry, I'll run a little bit longer. With this, we cannot entirely rule out the role of the people in the machinery of the economic policy. Well, we found out that they don't take decisions, they are not instrumental in changing things, but they are the ones signaling, or they are the ones alerting about the changes, or they are the ones also spotting the Western counterparts with whom it's possible to strike deals. So we cannot rule them entirely out of the attempts to overcome barriers, whatever they come from.
Thank you very much, Angela. This was very interesting, and we can move on to questions right away, and you can write your questions in the chat, or you can just wave your hands and I'll try to spot you, or raise your hand on the screen. But just I want to begin with one reflection on where we stopped with Angela's presentation, which also relates to Kirill's talk, and it has to do precisely with what you touched upon in the end of the case of debt perspective. So the dangers of borrowing, and you discussed very much, both of you actually, from the perspective of actors in the GDR, and my question relates, I guess, to the level of awareness of the dangers. And on both sides, also from the Western part. So to what extent is it justified to see this as a kind of at least on some level, a strategy, or is that just a reconstruction we do afterwards? And from the perspective of the East, if the policy advisors have some level of awareness of the dangers, to what extent is this communicated to the political decision makers, and is there anything to elaborate on that? And to Kirill specifically, I think you said something about the lure or the problem of credit and the awareness of this issue very early on in the 1950s, or if I'm correct. So would you care to comment?
I think Seven, I think I missed the last part of your sentence.
Okay.
So part of the question.
No, basically, I mean, you mentioned in your talk that there was an awareness of the cost of importing culture and the dangers of that very early on, and I think you mentioned in the 50s, and that was surprising to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly when it comes to the cultural realm, that was something GDR officials were terrified about in the 1950s. And then even further, but you can see them sort of ceding ground on that, right? And of course, a lot of this has to do with the dynamics of East-West German relations. If we're talking about the 1950s, that's before the wall goes up. There is massive concern on the part of the GDR leadership that Western culture is drawing youths across the border, since we know that migration was especially high among younger East Germans. And so there is a lot of cultural anxiety, especially when it comes to things like rock and roll, to say, you know, these imports are dangerous, not just because they're Western and suppressing our socialist culture, but because they might undermine the whole stability of the state. They might draw away the very people we're counting on to build it up. And in that sense, there is a shift when the wall goes up, when there is that greater geopolitical stability for the GDR, the role of Western culture becomes different. And I imagine, you know, Angela can speak much more to the economic case, but I imagine there's, you know, clearly there is a growing willingness to become dependent, even as the state knows its dangers. I will say, so to the question you raised, Stefan, about how much did Honecker and the rest of the SED know about this? Again, I can't speak to the economic case, but there's an interesting parallel in the case of public opinion polling. You know, the GDR actually does a lot of public opinion polling in the 1960s. And the institutes still continue to do this work, including one in Leipzig. The Institute for Youth Research in Leipzig continues doing longitudinal studies into the 70s and 80s. But I think it's in 1982 when Honecker explicitly tells his advisors, don't give me those reports. I don't want to see them. I don't want to look at them. I don't want to know, right? So there is not just an awareness of dangers, but there is a deliberate and conscious refusal to acknowledge the dangers, in part because they do run counter to this premise on which so much GDR policy is now based.
Absolutely. So I'll share the screen again, just to me. What we found out, so what the project investigated was exactly this kind of debate. So we know that there was an opening toward the West by the socialist countries in the 70s. We wanted to know the rationales behind, and also we wanted to understand whether anyone in the elites, in the governing elites, in the ruling elites, spotted this problem of indebtedness, because we know the end of the story and we know the triumphalist narrative, how, you know, this socialist experience has been washed away by the triumph of capitalism, blah, 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 and the capitalist Western globalization. But we wanted to understand, is that really that they were so stupid that they didn't see it coming, because, you know, those people were really savvy in economics. The level of the economists, the academic level of the economists, and their connections with the capitalist colleagues was phenomenal. So how is that is not possible? And indeed, that was the most important goal of the project, and we found out a lot of debate. So there are people in the GDR particularly, since the beginning, since the early 70s, already saying to Honecker, this is dangerous, absolutely dangerous. And so we see basically most of the part in the state apparatus is against this policy. So the State Planning Commission, the plan, the most important bit to organize the entire economy. The central bankers, one of the other, and the foreign trade bankers. So the bank is particularly, specifically devoted to fund foreign trade. Were saying this is nuts. This is going to create huge debts. The Minister of Finance. And then also some experts from academia, although the academia is divided because there are some also considering the opening to the West and even recognizing the European community would be beneficial. And then in the second part of the 70s, we have the Stasi also coming on board. They are economic experts doing phenomenal, like the CIA doing phenomenal investigation into how this can evolve, also stating, okay, that was really successful what we did in the early 70s. We got recognized, we got into the UN, we are now visible, we are one of the strongest economy in the socialist bloc, we are very modern, blah, 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 but this is getting out of hand. And then of course there are continual and increasingly so reproach from Moscow and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're becoming too dependent on the West German. You're getting too many loans. You'll never be able to repay. So it's in the GDR case, it's particularly striking to see a huge component of the elite ruling the country saying, this is nuts. This is really not what we should be doing. And a small circle, really called like that, around Honecker saying, we shall continue to do so because we cannot afford other uprising. So Honecker was traumatized personally by the 1953 uprising, and didn't want, and there was, of course, they were very attentive to what was going on in Poland with Solidarność, and they didn't want to risk that kind of contamination. So basically the idea, which is economically nonsensical, but is made sense at the time to guarantee the survival of the regime and of himself, was we shall appease the people as much as we can, and hopefully it will we will catch up because we will be able to export more in the future. So there is trouble now, but it will work. But we cannot suppress people's satisfaction because otherwise everything is going to explode. We are not, Poland is in trouble. We're not Hungary. We have the most prosperous West European countries just next door, and it's German. So we cannot match unless we do so. So in the Hungarian case, for example, which is also a story of indebtedness and opening much more than the GDR, we see different choices and different approaches. It's really something that was conceived and believed. In the GDR case, they knew it and they continue to do so. And if you allow me, but go on with the questions. I just wanted to show you, and I'll give Sylvia the address. We have an interactive map of the project. It's open access. Also, our publications are open access, and you can surf through all the elites and see a summary of their debates, the key documents that they produce, and also very much navigate the people and see their position in the debate, who was alerting, warning, who they were in contact with, and so on. So you'll see the small circle, but you'll see also those who were warning very much against this kind of approach.
Thanks very much, and thanks for showing the site. That looks amazing. I have to look at that later. One question to Paul, and sorry for going a bit beyond your talk, but this relates to the chapter I had the pleasure of reading before this discussion, and it has to do with your work on scientists as anti-nuclear activists, and you show in a very intelligent way, I think, the general problem of speaking truth to power from within power, so to speak. And this question is very much in the spirit of your statement in the beginning of seeing things from a really broad perspective from above, so to speak. But how would you describe this? I mean, this role of the intellectual that becomes problematic in the post-war era. So in the very long scheme of things, you have, of course, scientists from Galileo onwards performing the function of public intellectuals. But already when the term is then born at the turn of the 20th century and spreading from France, already at that time, you have scientists that are much more integrated in the state as civil servants. And speaking truth to power becomes more problematic. So it's usually writers and maybe artists who take on that role. But my point and question is that this dynamic evolves and develops in very different ways and along different timelines in different regions and academic and cultures and cultures of public debate and public sphere. So in your work, do you see interesting national or regional or linguistic differences here with respect to scientists and the role of scientists in these anti-nuclear social movements?
Let's see. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that is very much something that I see. I mean, one group I didn't talk about, there are scientists who tried to have a kind of transnational, speaking as scientists, the Pugwash group, and they even try this in the 50s and 60s, and they are really, it kind of devolves into a US and Soviet kind of superpower group who can influence their government. So it is very difficult for them to balance being effective with being excluded from government, which happens certainly a lot in the United States. There's this crisis with the Vietnam War and with scientists who criticize it are kind of they go along with the other movements that are attacking the role of expertise. And so you have in the late 60s, early 70s, you have scientists saying that science is just a bourgeois, practice that just rewards people who can afford fancy equipment, and so they by doing that, they are downgrading themselves in terms of their own public authority. And Science for the People is the most famous group, but they would famously say, science discriminates, it's sexist, and we want to change that. But they would also, bash the credentials, the expertise, right? So they would just not have, they did this to themselves, just like scientists, many of them willingly aligned with national security interests and spoke in the language of experts. The kind of opposite side of that was to somewhat question the authority of science altogether. And so you have a decline in the public sort of faith in scientists, right? Scientists didn't like other scientists who were popular, right? Carl Sagan with the nuclear winter theory goes on television and all these things, and the traditional, you know, the National Academy of Sciences bashes him for it and says, you know, well, that's not real. A real scientist doesn't do that, you know, and so it very much limits communication with the people. I see, you know, some of that overseas. You know, Bertrand Russell is another one of these guys who sort of starts from an academic viewpoint and then becomes more and more radical to the point where he does kind of alienate a lot of people. But at the same time, with you do see, like you said, other intellectuals from other disciplines rising up to take that space. And you know, like E.P. Thompson with all the anti-nuclear activism and so on. So, but it does seem, you know, it mattered if your country had a nuclear complex, right? You know, how badly your country needed you to make nuclear weapons would sometimes constrain your freedom of action. Of course, in the Soviet Union, it was the opposite. The nuclear physicists had a lot more room to speak up and speak out because they were so essential to the state. You know, in the United States, I guess they could just find some other nuclear physicist, but in the Soviet Union, they had to keep them happy. So it definitely did depend on national context to a great degree. One thing that they were often aligned with, though, was human rights. You saw a lot of you know, behind the Iron Curtain scientists and scientists on the Western side, they kind of spoke of human rights in largely the same way. So it also varied by the cause itself, although there were disagreements over the human rights issue, which you know, that's my current project. But anyway, so very much so, and a very, I definitely agree, and hopefully flesh it out for you.
Thanks a lot. I don't see questions in the chat, but I hope I'm not missing something. So Felix, please correct me if, yeah, okay. So would the speakers like to reflect on each other's papers, or are there questions from the audience? Well, Kirill has a question.
I've got some questions for both of my co-panelists, if I may, while others are thinking of questions. Angela, I wanted to press you a bit on this, on the kind of comparison of the GDR with the rest of the bloc, which was such a fascinating story. And, you know, as you show, it does have a different dynamic in terms of cross Iron Curtain trade than, say, Poland or Hungary. It has a different decision-making structure. That's fascinating. But then I wonder, how do we end up in what seems like the same place, where both Poland and Hungary get massively dependent on Western debt all the same, right? In fact, this was even called the Polish disease at the time. So what, you know, I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile this, right? If the GDR has this anomalous pathway within the bloc, why does it seem to be squarely in the same position as so many of its neighbors that presumably take different paths? And then for Paul, I was really interested in the nexus that you sketch between the anti-nuclear movement, human rights movement, and religion, feminism, all of these kind of different movements coming together. And I wonder what to make of that, right? Should we think of this as kind of one integrated constituency that can take up different causes? You know, is there so much overlap there that we should think of this as a kind of single global network? Or is there something about the nuclear movement specifically that's able to unite different partners with different interests in a way that other causes can't?
That was kind of my question, Paul. So I'll add up a question to Paul, and then I'll answer Kirill's question. Many thanks. So to Paul, I was thinking along the same line, but also in terms of moving beyond the Cold War. So do you think that particularly in the 80s, the anti-nuclear movement really gets out of the Cold War, strictly the Cold War confrontation, to become, so you touched upon other layers and other interests, other protagonists in the sense of the protest, but I was thinking also in terms of, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism and all the stuff. So would you say that this remains fundamentally a Cold War matter, or it evolves in something bigger in the same period of time? That's fascinating. So that there are common features in these countries, starting with the Soviet Union, actually in the mid-60s being the first one, realizing that the way of production of the socialist economies by then has exhausted its capacity for phenomenal growth. And so they changed the strategy, and it's an import-led strategy. So what they think, all of them, is, okay, there is a little bit of the tent. We can discuss with the West on many things. Economy has always been, trade in the best interest of both. Why don't we import Western technology, modernize quicker, in order to leap forward in the medium-term future, and of course we will be the best. It's just that at the moment we need to change some things, so we can benefit from the West a little bit, but we will win this fight for the best system. So they're very much convinced, and they have reason to be convinced. So in the 50s and early 60s, the Soviet Union, but the GDR in particular, have achieved phenomenal development. The Soviet Union led in the space race. So there is a lot there to be enthusiastic and positive about the strategy. So that by the mid-70s get crushed by a series of consequences, a series of events which are not in the hand or in control of the socialist countries, such as the oil shocks and the fact that the West is now not buying anymore because it's in deep crisis and so on. So they cannot export back. So that has broken the nice game that they had set up to play. So they modernized, and now it's time to sell back to the West, but the West is not buying anymore. And then there is the question that they do not recognize the European community, and so they cannot sell as much as they could have done had they been less rigid. So what happens is that those who are more exposed, and you mentioned that, so Poland, Hungary, and the GDR, get into the debt trap, which is the same, but at the same time, each of them gets into it for a different reason, slightly different reason. So the Polish, in the whole 70s, they were absolutely convinced to be Western in the sense of culture, in the sense advanced, in the sense of culture, in the sense of competitiveness and so on. The Polish socialist regime had the most open policy on passports for its own citizens after Yugoslavia. So they were really confident, they were overconfident, and so they didn't see it coming, actually. In the GDR, they saw it coming, but Honecker didn't want to risk upsetting the population. And in the Hungarian case, what we found out is that there is a part of the economic elite really trying to open up and plug Hungary into the world economy. And indeed, they are pretty quick to ask for membership in the IMF in '82, which of course is absolutely anathema in the GDR. They are very quick in striking deal after deal, sector, but deal after deal with the EC. So in a sense, they're kind of leaning into getting and trade. There is a part, at the very least, of the elite that is maneuvering to change the Hungarian economy in in the sense of getting out of this system and getting westernized. So I'm not saying that they planned everything to get indebted and then end up, but they definitely accompanied the process in order to, yes, globalize in a sense. And then Poland is kind of left alone, so there's no much to discuss there in terms of getting out of it. We do have the staunchest communist, the Romanian regime, getting into a debt trap and just squeezing the life out of its citizens to repay back the loans. And they did repay back the loan, and they did squeeze out the life of their citizens. And so possibly that also explained why that was a bloody revolution and not a peaceful one in the end.
Paul, did you care to comment the questions?
Absolutely, and they were great questions. And Kirill, your question about was it one constituency really, or was it one issue that could draw together? But that's something I definitely found myself or I asked myself as I was putting these thoughts together, the talk together. I think the original view was that this was kind of one constituency. In the United States, at least, the kind of new left evolves into civil rights, evolves into anti-Vietnam War, evolves into anti-nuclear weapons. And I think, to a degree that view would hold for what people, said about Europe as well. But I think obviously well, not obviously, but my initial thought is that doesn't hold up because some of these groups kind of can't stand each other, even when it's the same issue. Like if you look at human rights, at least in the United States, you've got your traditional sort of leftist activists, but you've also got a huge conservative constituency that wants to use human rights as a way to bash the Soviet Union and criticize leftism or leftist regimes. So I think to a great extent, and this is just my initial stab at it, is nuclear war has a pretty unique, maybe it's not unique, but it has this special malleability, right? That you can, humans have been seeing the end of the world for, well before nuclear weapons, right? So it's something that taps into maybe, I don't know, a primal consciousness of humanity, maybe, at least, there's been, all these fables about, scientists destroying the world, or even, Frankenstein's monster and all these things that I think, social movements and organizations are always looking to, motivate people to join their cause. And they certainly, the end of the world is often seen as a good one. And so that's kind of where I'm leaning. And Angela, it leads into your question, because after the Cold War, which was so, centered around nuclear weapons in many ways, a lot of the pure anti-nuclear organizations dry up or disappear to an extent, but you do see some of them evolving or just transforming into other organizations taking on global destruction, but this time in terms of climate change. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which had this doomsday clock counting down to nuclear Armageddon, they've changed it to they take environmental disasters into account now. And so I'm certainly don't mean to be cynical, but it's there is always somebody looking, how is the world going to end? And that's going to inspire a movement. And so this is something that I'm, well, anyway, this is as far as I've gotten, I guess, because if Angela, if you'd gone on longer, maybe I could have thought of some more things to say about it. But this is the way I'm leaning, and thank you for those questions.
Are there any other questions from the audience? in that case, I think we can start wrapping up, and I think that I'm very glad that all of these three presentations spoke so well to each other, actually better than I had imagined. So I really want to thank you all for giving us a glimpse of your wonderful work and great presentations and this discussion at the end. I'm only sorry we can't go out for a beer now, but this is how it is. So I wish you all a great continuation of the spring, and hope to see you live sometime later on. Thank you.